Welcome back to History Rewritten, where the past is not always as you were taught. Today, we embark on a journey that takes us deep into the frozen fjords of Scandinavia, across stormy seas, and into an alternate history where the fierce Norsemen of the Viking Age are not armed only with axes, shields, and longships, but instead with massive steel warships bristling with cannons, advanced navigation, and guns that could tear through any medieval army like parchment. This is the story of what would happen if the Vikings had modern warships and guns. To understand the scale of this transformation, we need to first look at the historical Vikings themselves. Between the late 8th and early 11th centuries, the Vikings surged out of Scandinavia in longships, sleek, shallow-draft vessels that could slip up rivers, strike deep into Europe, and vanish before defences could react. Their weapons were simple but brutally effective: swords, axes, spears, and bows. Their tactics were built around surprise, speed, and ferocity. But in this rewritten history, instead of longships, imagine fleets of steel destroyers and aircraft carriers, guided not by the stars and sun, but by radar, sonar, and satellite precision. The Viking dragon-headed prows are now emblazoned on the sides of hulking grey ships, their sails replaced by roaring engines. In their hands are rifles, machine guns, grenades, and rocket launchers. The question then becomes, how would this ripple across history? Picture the year 793 CE, when the first recorded Viking raid struck the monastery of Lindisfarne. In our timeline, longships carrying axe-wielding Norse warriors descended on the monastery and shocked Christian Europe. In this rewritten timeline, instead of longships, imagine massive warships anchoring off the coast, launching landing craft filled with Vikings carrying assault rifles. The monastery would not just fall, it would be obliterated. Word would spread across Europe, not merely of fierce pagan raiders, but of gods of war armed with thunder and fire. Christian kingdoms would be paralyzed in terror. Resistance would be futile. The Vikings would sweep across the British Isles in a matter of weeks. Instead of decades of gradual raids and settlement, England would collapse almost instantly under the weight of modern warfare. By 800 CE, London would be a Viking stronghold, not a Saxon one. Castles would never be built, because stone walls would crumble before naval bombardments and machine gun fire. The very idea of medieval warfare, knights, cavalry, armoured infantry, would never develop. The feudal system would not emerge because Viking domination would be total and immediate. From Britain, the Vikings would turn their eyes to Francia, the Carolingian Empire of Charlemagne. In reality, Charlemagne spent his reign building a vast Christian empire and fending off Viking raids. But in this alternate history, the Viking fleet sails up the Seine, not in longships, but in guided warships that could level Paris with artillery. Charlemagne's legendary Frankish cavalry would ride bravely into battle, only to be cut down by machine gun fire before they ever closed the distance. The empire that once gave rise to France, Germany, and Italy would collapse centuries early. Instead of Charlemagne being crowned emperor in 800, it would be the Viking chieftains, perhaps Ivar the Boneless or Ragnar's sons, who would seize the mantle of empire. Europe would not become a patchwork of feudal kingdoms. It would become a Viking-ruled continent under a single banner, its expansion powered by fleets capable of traversing oceans with ease. The Mediterranean would be next. Imagine a Viking aircraft carrier steaming into the warm waters off Rome, launching aircraft into the skies over the Eternal City. Rome, once fallen, would be shattered again. Byzantium, with its mighty walls of Constantinople that in real history withstood centuries of sieges, would stand no chance against Viking missiles. The walls that resisted catapults and trebuchets would collapse in seconds under bombardment. The Byzantine Empire, instead of serving as a bulwark for Eastern Christianity and a bridge to the Islamic world, would be erased. And that brings us to the Islamic caliphates, the great powers of the Middle East. In reality, the Vikings reached as far as Baghdad through river trade. But in this alternate history, fleets of modern warships steam into the Persian Gulf. The Abbasid Caliphate, one of the most powerful states of the medieval era, would be confronted not by traders, but by Viking shock troops with modern guns. Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic Golden Age, would be captured and plundered. The knowledge centers, libraries and scholars who defined that era might never rise, strangled under Viking dominance. Without the Golden Age of Islam, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine as we know them might not advance, or might be monopolized by the Norse. The Vikings, once seen as raiders, would become the sole keepers of human progress. But what about the rest of the world? The Vikings, with warships, would not stop at Europe and the Middle East. Crossing the Atlantic in modern carriers would be trivial. Centuries before Columbus, they would reach the Americas. Imagine Native American tribes confronted not by wooden ships and swords, but by fleets of steel vessels and rifles. The balance would be brutally one-sided. Instead of struggling to survive in Newfoundland as they did historically, the Vikings would dominate the Americas in the 9th century. Great civilizations like the Mayans and later the Aztecs and Incas would fall instantly to modern firepower. The Vikings would establish colonies across the New World centuries before the Spanish ever dreamed of exploration. This would mean that by the year 1000 CE, the world would already be tied together under a global Norse empire. Africa too would not be safe. The Vikings, drawn to the riches of gold and trade, would use their modern navies to sweep down the coasts of West Africa, conquering kingdoms long before the Europeans of our own history did. East Africa, the Swahili coast, even the Indian Ocean trade routes would be dominated by Viking fleets. They would encounter India and China not as raiders in wooden ships, but as superpowers with weapons beyond imagination. How would China react? The Tang dynasty was at its height in the 9th century, with massive cities, bureaucracy, and powerful armies. But even China's millions of soldiers, equipped with crossbows and swords, would be no match for gunfire, tanks, or bombers. The Great Wall, built to repel nomads, would crumble before artillery strikes. China, instead of flourishing independently, might become just another province of the Viking Empire. The implications of this global dominance are staggering. History as we know it, knights, castles, crusades, Renaissance, exploration, would not exist. There would be no need for Columbus to sail west because the Vikings would already rule the Americas. There would be no 100 Years' War, no Mongol conquests, no Ottoman Empire. All of these chapters of history would be erased beneath the iron fist of Viking rule. But the question arises, what would Viking culture itself become under this dominance? Historically, the Vikings eventually settled, converted to Christianity, and blended into the cultures they conquered. Would the same happen here? Or would their gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, be worshipped across the world, enforced by a Norse theocracy backed by unimaginable power? Christianity might be wiped out before it spread. Islam may never rise. Buddhism and Hinduism might fall beneath Norse supremacy. The cultural, religious, and philosophical foundation of our world would be rewritten. Science, too, would be transformed. With modern technology in their hands, the Vikings might never need to innovate. They could use the weapons as tools of domination without ever understanding the deeper mechanics. But over centuries, as Norse rulers tried to maintain their edge, they might seek to study and replicate the technology. Imagine Norse blacksmiths attempting to reverse engineer rifles, or Viking shipwrights studying jet engines. This would spark a scientific revolution centuries earlier than in our world, but one fueled by war and conquest rather than curiosity. The Renaissance would come not in the 1400s, but in the 900s, driven not by Italian thinkers, but by Viking warlords. And yet, there are challenges. A Viking empire ruling the globe would not be without internal strife. Vikings themselves were fiercely independent, their society built around chieftains and personal honor. Would they cooperate under a single emperor, or would infighting shatter their global dominance? Imagine fleets of Viking aircraft carriers battling one another across the seas, entire continents caught in the crossfire. The Norse gods demanded courage and blood. Would a world ruled by Vikings descend into endless civil war, fought with the most destructive weapons ever created? And what of the environment? Modern warships, aircraft, and heavy industry would devastate ecosystems centuries before industrialization in our timeline. The Earth might enter an age of pollution, deforestation, and climate change far earlier. By the year 1500, the planet might already be on the brink of ecological collapse under Viking rule. In this alternate history, the Vikings become not just raiders, but the first true global superpower, centuries before Britain, Spain, or the United States. They would shape the destiny of humanity in ways we can only imagine. A world united under the hammer of Thor, ruled by warlords with weapons beyond their age, and civilizations snuffed out before they could ever flourish. Would this lead to an early unification of humanity, advancing science and technology far earlier than in our world? Or would it trap us in a dark age of endless conquest, with innovation strangled by the suffocating grip of power? That is the paradox of this timeline. Greatness at the cost of freedom, progress at the cost of diversity. One thing is certain. Had the Vikings possessed modern warships and guns, the map of history would not merely look different. It would be unrecognizable. Thank you for watching History Rewritten. If you enjoyed this journey into an alternate timeline, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more explorations into what might have been. And as always, remember, this is not the history you were taught. This is history rewritten.